We now have the case of a natural monopoly, and we want to look at the difference. If you've printed out the slides, print out the slide from the previous discussion of monopoly and the graph for monopoly to take a look at the difference, because there's a big difference here, okay? The big difference graphically has to do with the position of the average total cost curve. Let's look at this. Let's look at a competitive situation where price, okay, the demand curve, and marginal revenue are the same thing. That is not true of our monopolist. Their marginal revenue is down here. But let's look at our competitor. Price and marginal revenue are the same, and so it's reflected in the demand curve. Their profit maximizing level of production will be where the marginal cost curve intersects the demand curve, where price equals marginal cost. That's their profit maximizing level of production. Now look at where the average total cost curve is. The average total cost curve is above that, meaning they can charge this price, money in per unit, but this is their average total cost, money out per unit. Money out per unit at profit maximization is going to be greater than money in per unit. And so they're going to operate at a loss. Because they operate at a loss, no one's going to want to produce it. Okay? And so what happens is we grant them a natural monopoly. Now, if we look for our natural monopolist, here's the marginal revenue, here's the marginal cost curve. They'll produce at the level where those two things meet. So they'll produce here. All right? The price they charge will be up here. You'll note the average total cost curve. All right? Even with the higher average total cost, and the basic difference between all I did when I made this graph was shift things. All you got to do, if the average total cost is higher, okay? And the reason that natural monopolies have largely collapsed were those that have collapsed. Cable companies are a classic example of this. Used to be cable companies back in the early days of cable in the late 70s and early 80s. They had monopolistic control. You couldn't compete. Now you can. Why? Because the average total cost, the cost of production, has slid downwards, okay? Bringing it below this level. Therefore, that breaks the natural monopoly, okay? And what broke the cable monopolies was technological. That's what broke the electric company's monopoly. The number one thing that breaks natural monopolies is technological advance. That's what broke the post office monopoly. Okay, the post office had a monopoly in the provision of daily mail. Okay, that broke because of technological advancement, namely the internet. Okay, who sends a snail mail letter anymore, right? The post office also had, early on, in the earlier 20th century, till about the 1970s, they also had monopolistic control over the delivery of packages. But that went away. That went away because of places like DHL and FedEx and UPS. Okay, they cracked the post office. And so if we can drop this average total cost curve, we drop the logical rationale for a natural monopoly. Okay, but when it comes to, there's a difference between for example, getting back to the electric companies, there's a difference between the provision of power, okay, and the production of power. The production of power, because of technological advancement, has dramatically shifted downward. But the distribution of power has not. It still has to come through those lines. Okay? If they could find a way of sending it without lines, that would drop the average total cost, and that would be the final death knell in Duquesne Light's monopoly. Okay? They haven't figured that out technologically yet. They still have to have, it still has to be sent via a wire. They did lower their total cost a little bit, though. The way that Duquesne Light works it now, they used to have a guy, and this increases their cost of production because they have to pay the guy, that would go house to house and read the meter. They don't do that anymore. Now they pay one guy and he can read thousands of meters because the meters, they changed my meter here maybe 4 years ago. The meter that they have sends out a transponder signal, okay, with the level of electric power, okay, with how much you've used, with the reading. It sends it out, and all the guy has to do is sit in his car within range of that transponder, and then they can read literally hundreds of meters at a time. All right, that lowered their average cost of production, but you still got to send it through the line. So the key here, getting back to this, the key here is that the average total cost curve, okay, is above the price that can be charged in a competitive market, okay, right here for profit maximization. Here's our profit maximizing level of production. Here's the average total cost, so you're operating at a loss. Okay, so what the government typically did was they granted a natural monopoly and then tried to regulate the monopoly so that the monopolist couldn't charge too much of a price. Now, by way of amplification about what we've been talking, this is kind of what I talked about last time when we were looking at the graph. The natural monopoly exists where the point at which marginal cost equals marginal revenue is less than the average total cost, meaning you're operating at a loss. Under conditions of perfect competition, the marginal revenue equals the demand curve, and from the illustration we note that the marginal cost is less, where marginal cost equals demand is less than the average total cost, meaning you're operating at a loss. Okay, that's the critical difference. And so, with the squiggly words are always the important ones, right? And so I put it in squiggly words here, the italics, that natural monopolies exist where the ATC is so high that the price-reducing pressures of competition would force firms to operate at losses and shut down. That's a natural monopoly. And finalized, this is what we've been talking about, is the number one thing that kills natural monopolies is technological advancement, because technological advancement is going to reduce the average total cost curve. And if it reduces the average total cost curve below where marginal cost equals marginal revenue in a competitive situation, then you can allow competition. We move on to dealing with other imperfect markets that are not monopolistic, particularly oligopoly. And what defines an oligopoly? We say an oligopoly is where only a few firms produce the entire finished product. Well, how few firms? Okay, how much of the product? Well, there are a couple of different ways of measuring it. The first is what they refer to as the industry concentration ratio. It's called the four-firm concentration ratio, and you see what it says there. It measures the output of the four largest producers, the four largest firms in the industry. Okay, and so we have a little simple numerical example here. If the total industry output is 100 units, and the largest four producers produce 50 of those units, the four-firm concentration ratio is 50. Okay, you take 100 units, 100%. So if you have four firms that produce 80%, that's a four-firm concentration of 80. All right. If the number is greater than 40, that constitutes an oligopoly. Okay. And once it gets to an oligopoly in the United States, within the macroeconomy of the United States, that's when Congress begins to think about regulation, is if it becomes oligopolistic. The other way of measuring it is the Herfindahl index, and it's a little bit more accurate. It's also a little more complicated. What you use is you take all of the producers in an industry, all of the individual firms that produce within a given industry, and you measure the sum of squares of their market share. And the easiest way to explain that is by way of example. The highest possible score is 10,000. Okay, so if you have one firm, this is the case of a monopoly. If you have one firm that controls 100% of the market, okay, that's the sum of squares. 100 squared, okay, that's 10,000. That's the highest concentration you can have. In the case of a duopoly, a pure duopoly, where you have two firms controlling 50% of the market each, okay, you would have the sum of squares. 50 squared plus 50 squared is 5,000. Okay, and so literally, and this is something I'm trying to come up with one that I can just do quickly here in my head. If you had a really competitive market, okay, let's say a farmer's market somewhere, where you have 100 producers, each of which have 1% of the market, okay, well, the sum of squares, you would take 1 squared, okay, plus 1 squared for all, for the 100 guys, and you'd end up with a Herfindahl index of 100, okay. In a really, really competitive market, let's suppose you have a market where you have 10,000, 100,000 producers, all of which control 0.001% of the market, okay, that would be a remarkably low Herfindahl index. We're not dealing with that here, okay? For the lower the index score, the more competitive the market is. Note the difference here. Again, let's just have our 2 producers, but this time let's have one of them produce 80% and the other produce 20%. You'll note that. That's 80% squared, 20% squared. That's a Herfindahl score of 6,800. So even though there's only 2 producers, this is why it's a little bit better, a little bit more accurate than the 4-industry concentration ratio, is because here you have 2 producers, but note the difference in scores. The reason this one, despite the fact that there's only 2 firms producing it, this one is more competitive than this one. Okay, why? Because here they've split the market evenly. Here you have an 80-20 split. Because of that, you have a higher concentration. I actually used this. I used a variant of this when I developed an index for essentially political concentration, to concentrate the control of a political system by one particular political ideology represented by a party. Okay, and so the greater their number of seats in the legislature, basically the way it worked out is the greater their number of seats in the legislature, the greater was their concentration, and therefore the less liberal was the political system, the less open the political system was. Okay. The way that Congress deals with this is if a merger creates a Herfindahl index of greater than 2,500, or the merger creates an increase in the index of greater than 200, the rule of thumb is to block the merger. This is why originally, when United Airlines and US Airways went into bankruptcy, this is back in 2002, 2003, their first plan of operation was to merge, okay, to try to create an economy of scale. Congress blocked that. Congress blocked that because they considered that that would create a horizontal monopoly, because United Airlines was an east-west carrier, US Airways basically a north-south. Well, if they merge, they've got monopolistic control of air travel, okay, or at least it creates more of an oligopolistic competition. So they blocked it. Years later, come about 2009, give or take 2010, United Airlines made a move to merge with Continental Airlines. Congress did not block this, and the two did in fact merge. Okay, my brother, who's a union negotiator for United, worked on this. He's a pilot for United and a union negotiator, and he worked on this. He worked on this and still works on it a little bit. The merger is set now, I guess. One of the nice things about it is that as a result, United picked up a couple of extra hubs, including Houston, which actually reduced their price. But at any rate, that's the Herfindahl index. And this I threw in here just to show low concentration, high concentration. Low concentration scores are highly competitive. And so these are more competitive industries. Okay, you see the 4-firm concentration, you see the Herfindahl score, and so the most competitive that we have here is bolts, nuts, and rivets with a Herfindahl index score of 6. That means you have enormous numbers of suppliers producing these. These would count as base materials. Retail bakeries, quick printing like Kinko's, stone products, okay, and so these are very low concentration, highly competitive. Here we see the more highly concentrated industries, okay, glass containers, 2507. these haven't been done because the concentration is so high. Four producers, in primary copper, four producers produce 99% of the industry. Cane sugar refineries, okay? So these are more concentrated industries. You still don't have Herfindahl index scores that constitute monopolies till you get to petrochemicals. This is the oil market. Petrochemicals is the oil market, okay? Interesting, breakfast cereals is up there. But again, I just threw that in there so you could see the difference in concentration levels of some of the industries. Here I just kind of synopsize what we've been talking about with the key differences. The profit maximization rule for the monopolist is the same as for the firm in a competitive industry. And this just kind of synopsizes all we've talked about, so you want to kind of just look over that. Okay. Now, kind of the last thing we really want to talk about is why it is that monopolies can exist, okay? And it's largely because there are barriers to entry, okay? If you look, for example, at the airline industry, it's very difficult to break into the airline industry because a commercial aircraft is about $200 million. Not everybody has $200 million to buy a commercial airliner, okay? And so the cost, actually, it's not 200 million. It's more like about 80 million. But at any rate, one of the primary is the cost of production, okay? So that one firm can create an economy of scale and produce the entire supply more efficiently than several small firms, okay? This is back to the idea of economy of scale with which we dealt with earlier, okay, that lowers the cost of production. The initial investment cost is too great for new competition. This is the cost of laying all the cable. This was the cost of laying the power lines, laying the gas lines, buying the aircraft, okay? And to the degree technological advancement improves, it can offset those upfront costs. The other one is patent protection. I talk about this, pharmaceuticals being an excellent example of this, but all patents work this way. You know, funny, this is just because I'm talking about this, it made me think of something funny. I don't know if you guys know what a socket set is, what socket wrenches are. Okay, everybody, any gearhead has socket wrenches. Any do-it-yourselfer has a set of sockets. The guy that invented those, okay, he sold the patent of that product to Sears for $10,000. Sears made hundreds of millions off of it. Okay, and so he sued them in court, and the court ruled that he deserved more money. Another way of stopping firms from entering into it is litigation, legal system, legal challenges. Selling licenses can help limit competition, and then finally, the awarding of government franchises limits competition. Okay. And I include this here kind of at the end, this problem, and this is one that we actually work out in microeconomics, but just to give you an idea. And just to see if what we've said about monopolies, and particularly the difference between monopolies and competition, has set in your brain. We ask some simple questions, and I ask them, I think, on the next slide. First question we'll ask. This graph right here, this problem, this picture, does this represent a case for a natural monopoly? Okay, well, let's look at what happens if it's a perfectly competitive market. In a competitive market, price and marginal revenue are the same, represented by the demand curve. For profit maximization, we produce where the marginal cost and the price are the same at this level. The question is, can you make a profit at that level of production? Well, here's your average total cost. So production per unit or price per unit is greater than cost per unit. So yes, you can make a profit and be competitive. And so as a result, this is not a case for natural monopoly. What if I were to take the average total cost curve and shift it up here? Well, then, yeah, it would be, you know, that's the whole defining feature, is your cost is too high to allow for competition. If we shift the average total cost curve up here, then yes. But where it is now, no, this is not a case for natural monopoly. Second thing, what's the profit level, profit maximizing level of production for a competitor? Okay, well, where marginal cost equals price. Level of production will be 40 units. What will the price be? $30. we could actually calculate how much revenue they'd make. They'd make $1,200, right? $30 for 40 units. How much profit would they make? That's a little bit harder to get at. The average total cost looks like about $27.50 here, and your price would be 30, so you'd make $2.50 a unit for 40 units. So you'd make what, $100 in profit. Now, let's look at our monopolists. What we said was that monopolies have a tendency to underproduce. Well, a monopolist is going to produce same as a competitor, where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. That's down here at 30 units. So sure enough, they're producing 10 units less. What price will they charge at that level of production to maximize profit? This price right here, $35. So they get to charge $5 more than the competitor, okay? And they produce less. Would they make more revenue? They'd make $1,050 in revenue, okay, instead of $1,200. So they don't make as much revenue. We're not talking revenue here, okay? You can make more money, you can make more revenue in competition, sure, but you face a higher average cost. And so you see their profit is much higher. Here's the average total cost curve at that level of production. And you simply look at the distance between that and the price, and that's how much money they profit. That's how much profit they make per unit. And that looks like $35 done. So they're making $10 a unit in profit. So they're making $300 in profit. Down here, they were making $100. And so that just kind of to give you an idea. And then I asked the questions on the subsequent slides. And so you want to go over that. What is the profit maximizing level of production in an imperfect market for our monopoly? What was it? It was, I think, 30 units. What is a profit maximizing level of production? 40 units. What was the profit for the imperfectly competitive firm? What is the profit for the perfectly competitive firm? What price can they charge at that level? All these different things. That helps, if you want to think about that, that solidifies the understanding of it. And we actually do this. We actually calculate this in micro. And here's the solution to it. What is the profit maximizing level of production in a monopoly? And we talked about all this a couple slides back. What is the profit maximizing level of production in a perfectly competitive firm? 30 units, 40 units. These are just the conclusions we draw from the problem and from the model. And it's stuff we just talked. We're just kind of synopsizing our conclusions here. One of the things is that monopolies tend to underproduce. Okay, that's true of all imperfect markets, but monopolies are the most egregious case of it. They're the most extreme case. And then we have the lower production level means that you need fewer workers, and so it has an effect on employment levels. And then finally, it has an effect on price levels. Our monopolist is able to charge a higher price than would be the case under conditions of competition. And then the final note here, the degree to which markets achieve economic efficiency is based on their level of competition. The more competitive it is, the more there is, the more competition there is, the more the phenomenon of that pressure to reduce prices takes place. Okay, you have profit. The more competitive it is, the more people are going to be able to go there. Okay, and so the fewer barriers to entry there are. Okay, the less availability of litigation, the lower the startup costs, the more competitive it's going to be. And that profit is going to get eaten up by numerous new competitors. That's going to create more of a pressure for prices to drop. This is going to be one of the primary arguments, okay, for free trade internationally. It forces economic efficiency, okay? In a monopoly, there's no such pressure that's exerted to drive markets towards efficiency. The other thing that we kind of finalize things with here is that the degree to which firms have market power is based on the level of competition. The more competitive the market is, the less any individual firm has market power. Market power is a zero-sum game. Now, what we mean by a zero-sum game is what one person wins, another person loses. Classic example of that is poker. Okay, so market power is a pie. The question is, how is it divided? In a monopoly, the firm has all market power. Okay, but in a competitive industry, all of the firms divide up that market power. Okay, and because they have to divide up that market power, the consumer benefits. All right, and that concludes the discussion of monopoly. The next thing we're going to do is dive in to macroeconomics.